The Secret Garden, Chapter 28, the final episodes. In the garden. While the secret garden was coming alive, and two children were coming alive with it, Mr. Craven was wandering through Europe. He had traveled through the beautiful mountains of Switzerland. He had seen the magnificent Norwegian fjords, but his heart was still unbroken. He could not shake the dark thoughts and nightmares from his mind. One day he was hiking in Australia when he decided to rest by a stream. Mr. Craven did not know how long he sat there on the carpet of green moss looking at the birds and the flowers. The sunlight seemed to wash over him. "What's happening?" he whispered. "I feel why it's almost as if I were awakening." Months later he would find out that this was the very day when Colin stood in the garden and said, "I'm going to live forever and ever." As summer changed into autumn, Mr. Craven moved on the Lake Como in Italy. He was starting to sleep better, and his dream no longer terrified him. He began to think of Mrs. Wade and wonder if he should go home. But every time he thought of Colin, he was reminded of his wife. He couldn't go home yet. One night he sat outside by the lake. The moonlight turned everything to silver. Mr. Craven fell asleep. In his dream he heard a voice calling him, "Archie, Archie." It was a sweet and lovely voice that he instantly recognized as his wife's. "Where are you?" "In the garden." The dream ended here, but he did not wake up until morning. A servant appeared by his side and handed him a letter from Dickens's mother. "Dear sir, please come home. I think you will be glad if you do. If you will excuse me, sir, I think your lady would ask you to come if she was here. Sincerely, Susan Sowerby." Mr. Craven remembered his dream. I must go home to Mrs. Wade at once," he said to the servant. When Mr. Craven finally arrived at the manor, he immediately sent for Mrs. Medlock. "How is Colin?" Mrs. Medlock didn't know how to respond. "To tell the truth, sir," he said nervously, "he might be better and he might be worse. No one can understand why he eats or doesn't eat. He likes Mary and Dickon. Every day he goes outside with them, but no one knows what they do or where they go." "Where is Colin now?" "In one of the gardens, I suppose." "In the garden," Mr. Craven repeated as he stood up. He felt as if he were being pulled toward the garden that he had locked up 10 years ago. He went outside and walked past the old fountain, flowers surrounding it now, and it was filled with water. He turned down the long path outside the walled garden. He knew where the door was, even thought it was hidden by ivy. But could he find the key? He stopped and listened. No one had passed through the door in 10 years, yet it sounded like children were laughing in the garden. What was this, another dream? At this moment, the door to the garden flew open. A boy ran and crashed right into Mr. Craven. Mr. Craven stared at the boy. His eyes were so dark, so like her eyes. But it couldn't be. "Father, I'm Colin," said the boy. "I know you can't believe it. I can scarcely believe it myself." "In the garden," said Mr. Craven, unable to say anything else. "Yes, it was the garden that made me well, and Mary and Dickon and his creatures and magic." Colin was breathless from running, and his words came tumbling out. "I'm really well. I just beat Mary in a race. Father, I'm going to live forever and ever. Forever and ever. Aren't you glad? Mr. Craven did not know what to say for a moment. He put his hand on Colin's shoulders. You must tell me all about it. And so Colin led him into the secret garden. Mr. Craven looked around, just as Colin had done his first time. There, marveling at the roses and other flowers. I thought it would be all dead. Mary and Deacon sat with Mr. Craven while Colin told the story of how they brought the garden back life. Ben Weatherstaff was there too, but he soon slipped back to the house. He wanted to be in the servants' hall when Colin returned. After a while, Ben went to the window. Look, what's coming across the grass. When Mrs. Medlock looked, he let out a little shriek. All the other servants ran out the window. Across the lawn came Mr. Craven, laughing and smiling, and walking by his side, as tall, as straight as any boy was Colin.